world order should look like. This one was founded in the mid-1970s.
But that's such a cynical description. What's their ostensible reason for existing?
They feel that the world should be organized around basically a trilateral consensus, and the trilateral idea that they're talking about is the U.S., Japan, representing hegemonic interests in Asia, and Germany, representing Europe. So the trilateral would be Germany representing Europe, Japan, U.S.
And Britain just gets left out.
Well, junior partner, former empire, they go along with us. Not that they're not consulted, but that this was a new conception of global power sharing, that the U.S. role in the world was changing. It was sort of multilateral rather than unilateral, right? International capitalist rather than, jingoistic nationalist capitalist. Yankee rather than cowboy, let's say. Say if Bush is kind of a cowboy, these were the Yankees.
Right.
David Rockefeller type Eastern establishment versus, the Wild West.
Greg, wasn't this economically based when you mentioned, weren't they those three nations had very good economies at the time that you're speaking, isn't it?
Well, they were beginning to dominate. But the point of the Trilateral Commission was not only about managing the world economy, it was about managing the world in general. And one of the things, Samuel Huntington, people should read if they really want to know the way the establishment thinks, he was one of the main thinkers for this. He writes still to this day and is still influential. He writes now about the clash of civilizations, how we got to take down, the fundamentalist surge. But he was saying then that what we need more apathy. The problem is people are making too many demands on government. There was a book that he published with a couple of other people called The Crisis of Democracy, published by the Trilateral Commission in 1976, shortly after Carter's election. Very interesting reading, even to this day. It's that what we need is more apathy because people are making too many demands. People are just want too much of government. We have to lower expectations of what people can expect from government. It's interesting. It's kind of worked out that way, Okay, the other thing is that we have to increase respect for the presidency as an institution. Executive power has to be re-legitimized. Remember, this is happening after Nixon, after Watergate, okay? Right after. So it's a post-Watergate reconstruction effort. How can power be reconstructed along new lines? And these were the ideas. So we have to have a more passive public. Oh, he also said that political parties is only one way of constituting a democracy. Maybe we should not have political parties. Maybe we'd have some sort of unity administration, break down the walls between the executive and the legislative branch. I mean, it's pretty scary stuff. And now this is 25 years ago. The project hasn't been completed. But to think of Brzezinski, who basically was the major domo of these efforts, as being a liberal, I mean, he can only be conceived as a liberal when you compare him to Dick Cheney or George Bush. Really, he's a center-rightist who is a war criminal, for God's sake. He's a war criminal. He in fact, created a war in Afghanistan. And you know what he said? It's interesting. I have the quote, but not in front of me. He was questioned 4 years ago about this decision that they made in the 70s, we're going to provoke the Soviets to go into Afghanistan and provoke a war there and, sucker them in. And they said, weren't you worried about, like being in bed with these Islamic fundamentalists? Don't you think this could be dangerous? And he says, well, I leave that to the judgment of history is what is more important, basically taking down the Soviet Union or a handful of radical clerics. Interesting. Okay. Very interesting. That was only 4 years ago. Just of how friggin' wrong somebody can be. And yet he's still very popular on the talk show circuit. Being wrong doesn't prevent you from being quoted.
Would your reading of history then, what kind of light would you cast Carter in, politically? I mean, everybody, the layperson on the street holds him up as like, he was the exception. He was a real good man.
I think Carter was a person who was possibly had some good intentions, but was basically bought and paid for by the establishment. I met Carter in 1976, right at the beginning, when he was being promoted by the Trilateral Commission and the corporate establishment as the next John Kennedy. It's amazing. Right before the New Hampshire primary, I think it was Time magazine publishes this cover story about Carter, and it's not a photograph of him, it's like a rendering, and they make him look just like Kennedy. It's really freaky.
A blonde.
He had no real popular base of support, but they put him up there. So there was a there was a meeting that was held down near in Brattleboro at some big plantation type place in Brattleboro for the presidential candidates running in the primaries, and a few of them were there. Fred Harris, who was a liberal, iconoclastic Democrat running for president, he comes. He's in a car by himself. He shows up. He gives a speech. Carter comes. Now he hasn't won a primary yet, right? He's an relatively unknown governor from Georgia. He showed up with 20 Secret Service agents. The guy was totally surrounded. It was as if he was already the Democratic nominee before the New Hampshire primary. Okay, you couldn't get close to him without having a body search. So, I mean, this tells you something. I mean, is it all spontaneous, or is there a little bit of a preconceived,
tail wagging the dog?
And for the establishment, it was like the Republicans, didn't seem viable. Jerry Ford was kind of a joke. They needed a new pony to ride, and Carter seemed like a good prospect. He was invited into the Trilateral Commission. I mean, these Trilateral guys are more liberal. I mean, if you have to choose villains, you might choose them over the Bush team. I'm not sure they're especially happy about these plans to go to war with Iraq. I mean, the main reason that you're not hearing objections right now is not because people think it's a great idea. It's because there's an election coming up in 6 weeks.
Greg, I wanted to ask you about that. The media's push and the administration's push for war. My feeling is that the government has gotten it down over the many years that they've been, in power, just convincing the public when to go to war. Boom, you get some excuse, some reason, and we go, and we're in. And the whole country is behind it. But this time, it's fascinating to me to watch the several attempts. Every day you see these headlines, and I'm just fascinated by Bush pushes for Congress to support, all the countries are not buying it, and it's just fascinating. To me, it's become so obvious that it's all about manipulation now. All they need to do is to find one. If they find some, say, there's a rumor that there's a photo of Saddam with Osama bin Laden or the World Trade Center thing. There we go. We're going to go in, and the whole country is going to be behind it because it has something to do with Al Qaeda and Saddam. They're looking for that thing. They're grasping for that one piece of evidence to hypnotize the whole mass of
right. Well, I think that's right. Although I don't know that they will actually need it because right now Congress appears to be ready to vote on a resolution, maybe not the exact one that's been put forward, but something, because they don't want the Democrats don't want the war to dominate the elections. They want to change the subject back to the economy. They can't change the subject back to the economy unless they answer the challenge of the administration. What's your position on, quote unquote, the war? So they're in this bind. They'd rather just sort of put it off and not deal with it until next year, but they have to deal with it now because they're being forced to, and they don't have the guts to basically say no because they're afraid of the downside in the election. Remember, Karl Rove said the Republicans were going to run on the war this year. He just didn't say which one.
So what is the time...
The war on terrorism or the war against Iraq?
Excuse me. So what is the time sensitivity in terms of the election with the war? We're not going to have a war until we have re-elected Bush, so that the Republicans can run on the war, or do we want to have it before so that we can't change horses in midstream?
Yeah. Well, I mean, now I feel like one of these guys on MSNBC or CNN, because, like the news right now is not news anymore. It's all like speculation. Well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we'll just sort of make up something. So
we're just picking your brain.
I don't know. I mean, my personal opinion is that, we're not going to have the new war, the expanded, new and improved, Donald Rumsfeld war, actually until next year, if we have it, because they're not going to actually send the bomber. First of all, it takes time, okay? You just don't, war, and, they go tomorrow.
Right.
I mean, but they want the vote now because it's important to have the decision now, to have a rhetorical and political, ideological victory before the election, all right? So, I mean, the thing that disappoints me is that we keep forgetting that the left keeps forgetting that there's an election going on. Maybe because we're so cynical and we think it doesn't matter who gets elected and who cares, but it kind of does matter because a lot of the reason why these things are happening is because there's an election. And even though I went to the demonstration against Cheney and I'm here talking to you, the fact that we're spending all our time talking about the war in Iraq, This is exactly what they want us to do. They want people to be preoccupied with the war and not thinking about the collapse of the economy, the incredible corporate scandals, and all of the other domestic issues, which are ultimately much more important. They want to change the subject. They have changed the subject, and we're helping them. I mean, the real dynamic is about globalization. Globalization, and the structural adjustment of the entire planet.
Right,
that's the issue.
Including the U.S.
Including the U.S. Privatization, deregulation, basically corporate crime on the global level.
Exportation of jobs.
Yeah, exportation of jobs, absolutely. Investments can travel, people cannot. These are the issues. But we're not discussing those now, are we? We're discussing the war. And who decided that?
We must say goodbye to Sylvia Airwaves, who has to go and attend to her real life.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Yeah. I mean, I want to get plugs in here for different things, so I don't want to...
Can we still pick your brain about the... I know, we're...
how much time do we have?
I know we're not supposed to be wasting time on the whole Iraq thing, but we want to talk about that.
Whatever you want to talk
We all
about. I
know...
just want to make sure that the conference tomorrow at UVM...
plug it. We have 10 minutes. We have 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, first of all, that there's this Stop the War conference, which, again, the name, Organizing for Global Justice, Peace, and Democracy. That's great. September 21st from 9:30 to 4:30 at Billings. I'll be there in the early afternoon to talk with Ben Scotch about civil liberties issues. There's a lot more events of this sort. Also, my organization, Toward Freedom, which is a world affairs magazine and nonprofit foundation. We do a lot of projects. We publish a magazine, which you can also see online at towardfreedom.com. And I just want to make sure you get that in. Anyway, so what about Iraq or anything?
A brief question. You want to talk about the film? Or?
What do you want to talk about?
The question I have, so we all learned about, how we set up the Taliban and we funded them and gave them arms and such, I guess, to start this thing with the Soviet Union. What was our relationship with Saddam Hussein and Iraq?
In the 80s.
In the 80s.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I didn't even get into that. Yeah, I mean, right, he was our guy. One State Department official said in the 80s, well, we know he's an SOB, but he's our SOB. No, seriously, this is a quote.
Wow, that's a quote. Wow.
Yeah, it's on, no, I forget who it was, but I've written a book which I'm trying to get published, which includes a lot of this kind of information. We supported Iraq in the war against Iran. Throughout the 80s. We provided Iraq with intelligence. We actually took them off the list of terrorist states. This is during the Reagan administration. We licensed the export of a lot of the chemical precursors that helped to create the weapons, the quote-unquote, the biological and chemical weapons, which we then subsequently said had to be destroyed, or we believe now are a threat to us. He was our guy.
Okay, listen, let's slow down.
Until 1990 and August the 3rd.
I don't want to assume any pre-knowledge on the part of anyone out there listening. Let's slow down and go over that with a little bit more of a fine-tooth comb. What was our relationship to Iran, let's say, starting in the 70s, and what was our relationship to Iraq, and how did those change? And we really have to analyze, our history with Iran to understand why we got in bed with Saddam.
Very good point. Okay, 1970s, Iran was run by the Shah of Iran. You remember the Shah of Iran? He was our friend. Okay, and we have to even go back further than that. Iran was a democratic country until 1953, when the CIA, U.S. government, Eisenhower administration, orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh. What did he do that was so terrible? He wanted to have a nationalized oil industry. All right? They portrayed him as a communist. They overthrew him. They installed the Shah of Iran. Okay, that's Iran.
They destabilized back in 1953. The most progressive Middle Eastern culture.
Correct.
The most progressive Middle Eastern, most open Middle Eastern society. The most Western, if you will.
It was
most
being
advanced.
rapidly Westernized, and this guy was not a communist. All right, so and these things have unintended consequences. So 25 years later, you have a reaction to that, a fundamentalist surge in Iran, which results in the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, and as many people remember, the capture of Americans who were held hostages for 444 days, and so on. So Iran then, from being one of our key allies in the Middle East, becomes a deadly enemy. So what do we do?
And that's when the Ayatollah took over.
That's when the Ayatollah took over.
There was an oil shortage, energy crisis, too. Does that come after?
The energy crisis was prior to that, several years prior to that, actually. But let's not go there at this moment. Let's just stick with Iran and Iraq, okay? So Iran, we overthrow, 25 years, that regime, puppet regime, client regime, you might call it, the Shah is overthrown by people we weren't sure whether they were progressive, regressive. A lot of people on the left were supportive of that revolution, strangely enough, because it